and it can actually be quite counterproductive, especially if these sets are too large, which is an issue we're going to be coming on to in a bit. At higher levels, it starts to change a little, because often when you present a set of vocabulary to, say, an intermediate or an upper intermediate student, some of those words will be familiar to them already. And that makes a huge difference, because they can already say, okay, I know this, so I know where I'm placing this in my mental lexicon. This word I kind of know a bit, but I'm not 100% certain, and this one is new. And they can slot the new words in with their existing knowledge. So then it becomes a much more useful task. So semantic sets can be useful, they're kind of nice, but you need to be a little bit wary about not just overloading students with lots of new vocabulary, because it's not necessarily going to be an effective way of learning. The other approach is what we describe as emergent vocabulary. And by that we mean vocabulary that emerges from a text. Now when I say a text, that could be something you're reading, or something you're listening to, or a conversation. But a language context, say take a reading text, and it's the vocabulary that comes out of that. And that may be a kind of semantic set, because it may be all to do with the topic of the text, but it's probably a little bit more varied. So if you're reading something about the environment, you might pick out words like climate change, like pollution, waste, congestion. So you would come up with vocabulary that is sort of connected, but maybe a little bit more mixed. And you haven't presented it in isolation. It's come from a context. And as I say, that might be something you're reading, or it could just be a conversation you're having, and the words that come out of that. And that has the advantage that students already have a context in their mind on which to hang that vocabulary, rather than it just being a disassociated set of words. So two different approaches to selecting sets of vocabulary. And I think both work in different contexts, and having a mixture of both can be a good thing. Okay, so you've selected your set of vocabulary. Now you have to think about what you're going to do with it and how you're going to present it. And I think this is a collection of thoughts that I have about what there is to know about words. It's not just about meanings. Yeah? So teaching vocabulary isn't just about teaching meanings. It's about thinking about the quantity of vocabulary. How much are you going to teach in one go? How much vocabulary would you teach in one lesson? What do you think would be a nice number?
10.
10?
Depends on the student.
Depends on the student, yeah? What sort of range? What would be the most? 10? 20? Yeah, or in one particular sitting, let's say. Yeah.
20 because a long 10.
Okay, yeah? What's the fewest? Yeah, one. There's no reason why you can't just teach one vocabulary word, you know. Yes, I mean, I would say, for me, 10 would probably be a maximum. More advanced students, maybe, if they were particularly greedy for vocabulary, you might go with more. But I wouldn't, you can't really go into depth with that quantity of vocabulary.
You mean head word, for example? I mean, if I have bored and boring, would you count that as one word? Or
No. I mean, it depends on the level of the student.
Okay.
You know, all of these things are rough, but you need to think about how much can we really cover here properly, how much is the student going to retain, and how much is just going to become overload. So quantity is important. Context, as I've mentioned before, is quite important. Less so with perhaps elementary learners, you know, hand, You don't really need much context for that. You know, once you get doing something with your hand. But most vocabulary, students need to see how it works in the language, how it fits together with other words, how it's used. Spelling and pronunciation, something that tends to get a little bit forgotten. We tend to ignore it, but it's something worth focusing on, worth talking about, particularly words where there's an unusual spelling or an unusual pronunciation. I was once taught in a teacher training session many, many years ago that you should never write a new word up on the board until you've said it. Because if the student reads it letter for letter and gets the sound wrong in their head, that's stuck and you're not going to undo it. I'm not sure if that's true, and I'm not sure if I always do it. But particularly for words with unusual spellings, it's something worth thinking about. To try and think about the pronunciation first and then get them to match the spelling to it afterwards. But then, I often say that knowing a word is a bit like getting to know friends. It's not just about knowing one thing. So you've got to know a little bit about the context to understand it, spelling and pronunciation. Collocation is quite a key concept for a lot of students. Which words are used together with it? Yeah. So do you do a mistake or make a mistake? It's the really obvious, boring one. But learning about the words that go together, learning about how it's used, which can cover all manner of things. It could be register. Is it a formal word? Is it an informal word? It could be connotation. Is it a polite word? Is it an offensive word? Also, something that I understand quite a lot of you teach teenagers. What is the appropriate age range of the word? Is it a word used by teenagers, or is it a bit of a middle-aged word? Which is, you know, it's something we don't always think about. It's something I actually did for my masters. I actually researched the language of teenagers, middle-aged people, and old people. And we do use language in different ways. And particularly if you're teaching teenagers, they don't want to go home sounding like a, you know, middle-aged housewife, or whatever however you describe yourself. That's me I'm talking about here. So think about what's relevant language to them. Now, I'm not saying you're teaching them all the trendy slang and whatever, but get them to listen out for things that are relevant to their own age group, but with warnings. That, you know, yes, this is the sort of word that teenagers your age might use with their friends, but you're not going to put in your school essay. So usage can cover all kinds of different things. And then what I've described as lexicogrammar. So what's the grammar of a word? If it's a noun, is it uncountable or is it countable? What's the plural form? If it's a verb, is it transitive, is it intransitive? What are the past tenses? So these are all things that you can be thinking about when you're presenting vocabulary. It's not just about, this is a word, this is what it means. And I think they're things that build up over time. You can't teach a student everything about a word the first time they meet it. Same as you don't know everything about a person the first time you meet them. Each time you meet them, you find out a little bit more. And that comes on to the idea of recycling, which I think is absolutely crucial with vocabulary. It's this idea of coming back to words again and again and again, which again, you have a really good opportunity to do because you're the sole teacher of this student over a period of time. So you know which vocabulary has come up and that you focused on before that you can bring up again and delve into in a little bit more detail each time so that students really get to know the words. And they're kind of, vocabulary learning is generally a process of moving from receptive vocabulary, words that students recognise and understand, and then gradually they move into their productive vocabulary, so vocabulary they're able to use for themselves. And that's a slow process. And you shouldn't necessarily expect students to understand and use and have the correct collocations and the correct grammar all at once. Yeah? So think of that as a process of getting to know, feeling at ease with the language. So there are a few things to think about presenting vocabulary. But what about the actual vocabulary? What about the actual activities? The title of this talk was Doing Things with Words. And the reason I chose that title is because I think that's what vocabulary teaching is all about. It's not just about presenting words, it's about getting students to do things with them. Yep. It's no good just reading a list, that's not how you learn. It's about actually doing stuff. So, trying to avoid, I think, mechanical activities which don't really involve the student engaging with the word. We can all think of activities where it's a gap fill or it's a multiple choice, and you can kind of work it out without really knowing the meaning. You can make educated guesses, and it's, process of elimination. And well, I know this one, so the other one must be that. But you haven't really understood it, haven't really thought about it. So that's something to be careful to avoid. Although they're quite nice. When I was thinking recently, when I was watching the Olympics in Sochi, I was enjoying looking at all the Russian script, because when I was at university, I did a year of Russian. I hated it. I was rubbish at it. The only thing I enjoyed was the handwriting practice. It was totally mechanical, and I loved it. So, again, it's one of those things. It's a bit like learning those big semantic sets. Sometimes you just want the easy stuff, but generally it's not really going to promote much learning. And also thinking about, are you promoting learning or just memorisation? Are you getting students to really connect with the words and understand them, or are they just memorising them in a way that they won't really be able to make use of them? For me, a good vocabulary activity involves a bit of analysis. It involves the student working a bit to understand the words. Now that might be that they're trying to guess the meaning from context. It could be that they're looking at the structure of the word, that you do a little bit of work on prefixes and suffixes. You say, well, do you think this is a verb or a noun? Oh, it's a verb. Well, how do you know that? It may be that you send them to the dictionary to look for themselves. And that process of having to analyse and think about the language a little bit will help in the learning. You're not just giving them the answer straight away. I think it's important for both the teacher and the materials to put the words into context, but for the student also to put the word into a context, perhaps a different context. And this comes on to the idea of personalisation.